Good morning, John Muchler here, pastor at the Ferndale Alliance Church, and our passage today is Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 through 20, and the main point this morning is this: Jesus loved and lived and taught and believed the Old Testament, and he tells us as his followers to ignore it at our peril. We're at a transition point in the Sermon on the Mount. We looked at character traits of a believer, of a Christian. He's humble, he hungers and thirsts for righteousness, he's merciful and things like that. And now we are transitioning to Christian ethics. From character to ethics, or how does the Christian life work itself out? We're going to learn that the ethics of the Christian life are rather radical. They are radical ethics, but we shouldn't be surprised because Jesus himself was extremely radical. Jesus is going to use the Old Testament, particularly the Ten Commandments, to reveal the heart of God and to reveal really what God's intent was when on Mount Sinai he delivered the commandments to Moses and to the Israelites. And we're going to delve into this later in chapter 5. Jesus takes various commandments as samples, as examples, to show us what the true intent was. I'll just give you a little preview here. Jesus says, you've heard the Old Testament commandment. I think it's number 6, thou shalt not commit murder. Jesus says if you hate somebody, or if you just call somebody worthless, you are committing murder. And if you think about it, deciding that somebody is worthless, especially if you decide a whole class of people are worthless, it's easy to begin to discard them, to marginalize them, to somehow eliminate them. Ask the descendants of some 6 million Jews who were wiped out in Europe during the Holocaust because they were deemed unessential, or they were deemed worthless or useless. And so murder begins in the heart when we begin to say that certain people have no value. He goes on and talks about adultery, and we all know what adultery is, and we might pride ourselves on never committing actual physical adultery with another person. But Jesus says it's deeper than that. It's what goes on in our hearts. And that we hurt our primary relationships, the relationships of family, when we begin to covet the wife or the husband of somebody else and play that out in our minds. Do you see how Jesus radicalizes commandments of the Old Testament that seem to be very straightforward, but he says you need to get to the heart of the matter, what God is intending by these commandments. And that's what he's going to do here in Matthew chapter 5. But first he gives us kind of an introduction to the subject. I'd like to begin by reading our text this morning. It is 4 verses. I'd like to invite you to follow along if you have a Bible. I happen to be reading out of the New International Version, Matthew chapter 5, beginning at verse 17. And the main point is, note how much respect Jesus had for the Old Testament. He says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets." That's just fancy language for the Old Testament. "I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." I give them the main point, you can't miss it just from these words, that Jesus thinks that the Old Testament is pretty important. And shouldn't we now? He didn't ignore it, he didn't doubt it, Jesus didn't diminish it or dilute it in any way. He embraced it, he taught it, he fulfilled it in his personal life and in his role as Messiah. And he gives careful teaching here how we are not to be slaves of it, which is what the Jews became over time. They became slaves over their traditions and their very narrow interpretations of the law, but we are in fact set free by it to live the abundant life that God has for us. That is where Jesus is headed when he radicalizes the teachings of the Old Testament. That's what he does for us, and that's what we're going to look at over the next few days. So people sometimes ask me, people that find out that I'm a person of faith, do you really believe the Old Testament? Do you really believe that stuff that's in the old part of the Bible? Yes, I do, and I do for one reason more than any other reason. It's not that I fully understand it. I don't. It's not that it all makes sense to me. It doesn't. It's not that it all kind of comes together in perfect harmony for me. It certainly does not. It's not that I have all my questions answered. In fact, every time I get a question answered, usually 2 more questions arise. I believe it for this reason particularly, if not for this reason alone. Jesus believed the Old Testament. Listen to me carefully. Jesus believed the Old Testament. There's not a hint anywhere in the scriptures that Jesus had any doubt as to its truthfulness or its authority, its accuracy, or its applicability to our lives. Now, he changed our understanding of it. Of course he did. Radically so. But he had incredible confidence in the Old Testament. He speaks of people that are named in the Old Testament, people like David, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Jonah, the first couple, Jonah, Elijah. He speaks to them as if they were real people. There's no hint that he considers them myth or fairy tales. In fact, Jesus' teaching makes no sense unless these people and their words and their stories and their lives are real. You know, we do that today. We will reach back into our history and use and find examples. The example of George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, people like that, and we don't treat them like fairy tales. Their examples work for us because they are true and real. Well, Jesus treats these people in the Old Testament in the same way. Jesus' teaching falls apart if these are not real people. And the main point is he had utmost confidence in the law, the Old Testament. The books of Moses, that's the first 5 books. We call that the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, all the way to the last book of the Old Testament, which closes the Old Testament canon, the Old Testament grouping of books. That's the book of Malachi. There's a pause, and then Jesus emerges, announced by the new Elijah, John the Baptist, and of course we have the New Testament. Jesus never disagrees with the Old Testament or corrects it or hints that he ever doubted it. And he could have done that. If Jesus, I know you read such and such in the Old Testament, let me correct the record. Let me set the record straight for you. He rather has this great formula where he says, you've heard this, but I'm going to expand upon it. I'm going to bring it to a higher level. We're going to radicalize the Old Testament in terms of what God really meant by it. And this is important to know. Without the Old Testament, there is no New Testament. Without the Old Testament, there is no Jesus. Without the Old Testament, there are not the 4 Gospels, each of us giving a different but a complete picture of Jesus Christ. Now, I will admit, some of it's hard to understand. And I've spent the last 40 years of my life studying it, learning, growing, and becoming ever more confident in its reliability and its truthfulness. Doesn't mean I have all the answers, all the questions answered. I certainly don't. But there are some great resources. We have never lived in a better time to get some of those answers, some of those questions answered. I like to suggest one book, and I've mentioned this recently, so I'll mention it again in case you missed it. Understanding the early chapters of Genesis in light of science. And I love science. I read a little bit of science every day because to me it affirms my faith. But a great book to read, or you can just look up on YouTube some of his many lectures. There's a book by Hugh Ross, Dr. Hugh Russ. He is an astronomer with a PhD. He's also a theologian, and his book is called A Matter of Days, Understanding from a Biblically Correct but Scientifically Correct View of the Days of Genesis 1 through 3. There are some YouTubes on him. Again, A Matter of Days by Hugh Ross. So again, back to our main point. Jesus believed the Old Testament was true and essential and purposeful for our lives, and so should we. He has this interesting phrase in our passage today. He says, "For truly I tell you," this is verse 18, "For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." That's an interesting formula when he says, "But truly I say to you." In other words, I am telling you the truth. These are extra words that Jesus adds here. It's like he's saying to us, you can count on it. You can take this to the bank. You don't need to doubt this. This is almost like a celestial court where Jesus is raising his right hand and saying, "I tell you, this is true." He is emphatic about it here, and so we should be as well. So, are you a follower of Jesus? Are you part of that club that's climbing with Christ the mountain to discover God more and more? And I don't care if you're Lutheran or Catholic or Baptist or Pentecostal or Reformed or Mennonite or Alliance or traditional or charismatic or seeker or whatever. If you are a follower of Jesus, you need to love and learn the Old Testament because Jesus did. So over the next 2 or 3 messages, we're going to discover what Jesus thought of the Old Testament and how he radicalizes it for us. And I believe that when we're done, we're going to appreciate so much more what is in the Old Testament. So I look forward to seeing you. God bless you and God keep you this day.